How are you doing?
Pretty good. It's a bit crazy right now.
Well, let's see what we can do to make it more sane. Let's start by talking about the writing lesson you just taught.
Okay.
Just so we're on the same page, the purpose of our conversation today is to reflect on your students' thinking and learning with respect to the targeted idea for the lesson. Let's think together about how we can use our evidence of students' thinking and learning from our different vantage points in the classroom. Let's use the stoplight model for reflection to guide our conversation. The stoplight will help us think about students' understanding of the learning target, what helped or hindered their thinking, and some of the next steps to support their learning.
Sounds good to me.
So, remind me, what was the learning target for this lesson?
I wanted students to understand that authors with different opinions about a topic sometimes use the same evidence to back up their claims.
So, by the end of the lesson, do you think students understood that?
Well, the subject of the essays was the pros and cons of standardized testing. I think some students had a hard time letting go of their opinions about testing, to the point that they could only criticize the author they didn't agree with, instead of examining the two pieces more objectively.
What do you think were some of the reasons students couldn't look at the piece objectively?
I think the subject matter of using state testing to evaluate students just hit too close to home since they just went through testing last month.
How did it hit close to home?
I think those recent tests might be too fresh. There might be some frustration from the students towards the idea of standardized testing.
So the students are unhappy about the testing, and for many, the idea of using their scores as a way to evaluate them is unacceptable. In reading their responses to the piece, they do seem pretty unhappy. What were some things that helped or hindered students' understanding of the targeted idea?
Well, maybe the question I asked was a little too open-ended?
And how do you know?
A lot of the students' responses never talked about the author's opinions and how these opinions related to the data. The students were so fired up about the topic, they wrote a ton about the state testing they just completed, and many of them just complained about it.
So it seems like there might be a couple of issues. On the one hand, students didn't use evidence to defend or refute the author's claims, and on the other hand, the recent state testing was still too fresh on their minds. Of these two, which do you think most impacted the quality of students' responses?
I don't know, they both seem really important.
Let's revisit the learning target for the lesson. What are some of the things students should include in their written arguments to show that they can consider how two different authors can use the same data to support two very different opinions?
Well, I want the students to look at the data as used by the author so they can explain how each author used the data to back up an argument.
Okay, what are some things you could have the students do to use that data?
I have no idea.
Well, some things that I've done in the past that have worked are dividing the class so different groups focus on just one author's ideas, having the students identify the specific data that supports each author's argument and explain how each author uses the data to their advantage, or developing a rubric that the students can reference and apply as they read through each opinion and write their responses. Of these options, is there one that you think would work well with your students?
I think developing a rubric would really help my students stay on task since they're so passionate about the topic.
When I've used rubrics to help students stay on task, I introduce it at the beginning so they have a frame to reference throughout their work. I've also found that it really helps clarify what success means and looks like. I try to use student-friendly language and have found that it really helps to have the students think, pair, share their understanding of the rubric before they begin their work. That way, they can develop a shared understanding of the expectations and ask any questions to clear up any confusion about what's expected. Then, after students complete a draft, their work has benefited from using the rubric to self-assess their writing or assess a peer's work.
Do you think you could help me develop one?
I'd be happy to.
Thanks.
So, tell me about your students' understanding and what you're going to try next to support their learning.
Well, we've decided that students didn't develop their understanding of the targeted idea like we'd hoped. So, we're going to try to co-develop a rubric that will help students understand the task, its expectations, and what successful responses look like. I'm going to use this rubric to introduce the task as a self and peer assessment tool. I'm feeling pretty good about the next steps.
Nice work.